Well, it's good to be here with you guys today. This morning we're getting started in a message that is in our Under the Rug series. We've been in this series now for a few weeks. We started it 3 Sundays ago with a talk called I Need. And then last week, Pastor Micah did a message entitled Hide and Go Seek. And it was a fantastic message. I hope you were blessed by it. Today we're continuing in this series, but before we jump in, I want to remind you something that is on the back of your sermon notes. If you grab sermon notes on your way in, there's a reading plan, and we've been doing this. We've been putting a reading plan on the back. For those that don't know, we are reading through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, from January to Easter weekend. And if you have not joined us yet on this journey, we'd love to have you jump in right away. The area that is highlighted in the red box is what we'll be reading this week, Monday through Saturday. And don't worry about trying to make up the past chapters. Just jump in this week. We'll be in the last week of Jesus' life at the end of Matthew, and then we'll be starting with the book of Mark midweek. And just as a reminder, the book of Mark is Peter's account. Mark was an associate of Peter, and Peter gives his account of the gospel story, and it'll be a real blessing to you. So hopefully you can join us for that. This morning, we're going to start off with a passage that you probably are familiar with or probably heard at some point or another. It comes from Matthew chapter 18, and Jesus is going to be asked a question, and he's going to give an answer that appears very difficult to actually do. It says this in Matthew 18, verse 21. It says, "Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, 'Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me?'" Have you ever asked that kind of a question? How long do I have to put up with this? And he asks another question, up to 7 times. And Jesus answers. I don't know if this was an immediate answer or if there was a kind of a pause to let it linger, but Jesus is going to respond to him. It says, Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, that number seems out of reach. To do it 7 times seems achievable. To do it 77 times would seem like it's out of reach. Some translations actually say 70 times 7. And don't get lost on the numbering of that. Just a little tidbit, kind of a study nerd. If you jump back into the Old Testament in Hebrew, that's called the Masoretic text. The Old Testament in Greek is called the Septuagint, and there's a difference in the wording there as to pointing to how a sin or how a wrong was handled. And so that's why you get some disparity in the number. 77 or 70 times 7 is not the point. The point is that it is beyond your capacity to keep track of. And it's interesting that this is what Jesus says to Peter. There were many times that Jesus would be teaching, and he would teach in a large gathering, or he would teach to the entirety of the disciples, and he would say something that was a little challenging. It would say something that was almost confusing, and one or more disciples would go to him privately and say, "Can you expound on that? Can you explain that?" And that's exactly what happens here. Jesus had been teaching. Peter hears something, comes to him, says, I got a question on how to really live that out. Like, how many times do I have to forgive my brother if my brother sins against me? And I'll just ask the question, 7 times, is that enough? And for us to really understand what's happening here, it's better to look at what set it up. The question was set up by something Jesus had said before. So if we rewind the tape a little bit in Matthew 18 and we look at verse 15, we see this statement. If your brother sins against you. Now pause. As you see that up there in yellow, everything that is going to follow is going to be prescription. Everything that is going to follow is going to be, here's how you go about approaching this. But the problem is what's in yellow up there. The problem is you got hurt. Somebody sinned against you. And if somebody wounds you, somebody offends you, somebody hurts you in some capacity, Now, don't just let that linger. Don't just let that stay. Here's how you'll go about trying to solve that. From that, Peter's going to ask the question afterwards, how many times do I have to put myself through this? Because the reality, and we can play church all we want, and we can give real surface answers and go away saying, yeah, that forgiveness is simple. But if we jump into the reality of getting hurt or somebody wronging us or somebody sinning against us, whether it be a friend or a family member, truth is, there's a time component to that. I don't just say, yeah, I forgive you, and then I move on, and my heart follows my words. If I'm really wronged, if I'm really sinned against, there's a time component that this is going to be hard for me to get through. And I'm going to have to process it. And it's going to be hard. And so Peter's asking, how many times do I put myself through that? And Jesus is going to say, for as often as it happens. Now, let's be honest here. Have you ever had that situation where somebody has wronged you in some capacity, and in your mind you have all kinds of answers and how you ought to address it? Next time I see that dude, I am going to throw it down. And you have all your answers, but then the Holy Spirit is nudging you and say, I want you to be gracious. I want you to operate in forgiveness. I want you to operate peacefully. And you acquiesce and you're like, okay, Lord, I'll do it. And you planned on doing it right until you saw him. And then all those plans went out the door. And it's like, not today, Lord, tomorrow maybe, but I'm still mad. That's kind of the scenario that's playing out here, where somebody has been hurt. Now, the Jewish rabbis that taught in the day that Jesus lived, they knew that this expired a lot from your soul, and they knew there was a time component. So all they required, all that was taught was 3 times. That you only had to put yourself emotionally through that 3 times. And so Peter says, what about going above that? What about 7 times? And he's not being heroic when he says that. He's actually being biblical in that. Because in the Old Testament, vindication was connected to 7 times. And he's saying that if vindication was authorized 7 times to a 7-fold generation, does that mean that I've got to also do this in my soul 7 times? And Jesus is going to say, no, it's going to need to happen as often as it happens to you. And that becomes really, really, really hard to do. Now, hold that thought for just a second. Today, as Pastor Micah said, is Super Bowl Sunday. And there are 2 teams that are going to play a football game today, and the 2018 season will conclude. Back in July, there were 32 teams that gathered at their defined headquarters, ordered equipment, came in, had strategy, had game plans, had paid personnel, all with the same agenda of hoping to play today. 32 teams that had hoped that they would be playing today on February 3rd. And they started their first game September 6th on a Thursday or September 9th on a Sunday, and they played this whole time still with the agenda of playing today. And whether it be through injury, whether it be through broken execution, whether it be through they just weren't good enough, whether it be through a variety of things, only 2 teams are going to play today, meaning 30 teams fell short of their goal. This last week, I was on a cruise with my daughters. I took my 3 girls away just on a dad-daughter cruise. And I like watching people. How many people are people watchers? I love watching people. You don't need Netflix. Just watch people. They are entertainment enough. And if you really want it, like jacked up, go on a cruise. You'll see some stuff. So there were a number of times that I was on this upper deck just kind of watching people. I love watching people. It's the source of my messages. And I was thinking to myself, how many of these people that I'm watching are coming up short? How many of these marriages on this cruise are coming up short? And this cruise is just a desperate play to save something. And how many people on this cruise are coming up short vocationally? Or how many are coming up in their parenting? They're coming up short. Or how many people are coming up emotionally, coming up short? Had the agenda playing in the last game, but I didn't make it. There was one couple that just really stood out to me, and I'm assuming they were married to one another. They had wedding rings on, and they were about a foot apart from one another, and she is dancing. There was salsa music going, and she is just killing that floor dancing, and she's not looking at him, but she is dancing with everything, and he was so entirely disinterested in her. 1 foot away, not even looking at her. And I just was asking myself, I wonder if they're coming up short. And what do you do when that happens? There's a phrase that we wrestle with rug, putting things under the rug. And I want to give you a fill in the blank, but I'm going to have to explain it after you write it in. But I want you to write this, a question that it's important for us to ask from time to time. And here it is, and you'll need explanation on that. Is there a cow under your rug? Is there a cow under your rug? And make sure you put in the dots behind each letter. Is there a cow under your rug? When we say sweep something under the rug, it carries the idea that it's small, it's debris, it's dust. It could be hidden under the rug until I resolve it at a later date. But for right now, I'm just going to sweep it under the rug. But imagine the silliness and how ridiculous it would be to have a rug on top of a cow. There would be no way that you could hide a cow under a rug. It would look entirely silly. So let me explain what that is, and you can write this in your notes. Off the record, your cow is criticism, being offended, or wounded. When you've been offended, or you've been hurt, you've been wounded. But on the record, you don't say that. We don't say that in circles. We don't say that at growth group. We don't say that in our private setting. We'll use the term disappointed. I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in you. I'm disappointed in this. I'm disappointed in them. We'll frame it a little better, but the truth is we have a cow under the rug. And you might not have been able to properly label something that's happened to you, but you could identify with that final line. It didn't have to go down like this. Like if you saw a friendship dwindle and fall apart, you probably thought at some point it didn't have to go down like that. Like if you didn't want to be with me or hang out with me, I mean, we could have done this without you having to destroy my character or my reputation. If you've ever been in a broken home, you could have gotten what you wanted. You didn't have to destroy me along the way. If you had a parent that just, for whatever reason, didn't applaud you the way that you would think a parent would applaud, it didn't have to go down like that, though. Like if I was a problem for you, fine. But it didn't have to go down the way it went. I think we can all identify with being in settings or scenarios where we look back on it like it didn't have to go down like that. They could have had their way still, but we didn't have to hurt each other. We didn't have to abuse one another. I didn't have to get wounded in that regard. And it's interesting that Jesus is giving this teaching when somebody hurts you, because there's a time component there. You know, sometimes people will leverage the whole, don't let the sun go down on your anger. You know, Jesus is, if I can just give you my opinion, Jesus is not talking about the clock on that. Like if you got offended at 8 in the morning, you have an advantage to the person that got offended at 3 p.m. That person only has an hour and a half to get their stuff together, and you can stew for hours before you have to solve it. He's not talking about the rotation of the globe till the sun kind of falls away on your horizon. He's simply talking about the fact of if you resolve or don't resolve to reconcile, if you resolve or don't resolve to find a place of peace with this. And you wrestle with this. He asks, Peter asks him, Lord, how many times do I do this? And Jesus gives him this answer. But I want you to write something in your notes, and here's why I think he does this. Write this in your notes. Truth, it's not a sin to be disappointed. However, being disappointed and unforgiving can't become your identity. Because if I don't resolve to settle something when I'm wounded, broken, offended, whatnot, if I just let that thing hang and linger and I'm just going to cover it with a rug, then some point that is going to get stitched into my identity. And here's what I mean by that. You have to watch the front side and the back side of Jesus' teaching. On the front side, he said, is that if your brother sins against you. And then he's asked the question, how many times do I put my soul through this? And he says, as often as it happens. And then he says, let me give you a parable. And a parable was always to point towards something in the human condition. And he says that this is the parable, and that for us in our recording, it's referred to as the unmerciful servant. He says, imagine this. There's this guy that owes this massive debt. He'll never be able to repay it. And the king, who the debt is owed to, threatens to throw him in jail. He is going to lose his family. He's going to lose his spouse. He will never see them again. He'll never be able to rectify this debt. So the guy throws himself on the mercy of the king, falls on his knees, begs for mercy, begs for forgiveness. Please pardon my debt. And the king says yes. The king pardons him. And then this guy goes from being a prisoner to being freed, and he leaves. And then he goes out, and he finds himself crossing paths with somebody that owed him money, but not near as much. It was a smaller amount. This kind of amount could have been paid in a short amount of time. But he calls for him, this guy that owes him, to pay up. This third-party guy falls on his knees because he has no money and he's begging for mercy. But this time, the guy who was forgiven by the king has a decision to forgive or not forgive. Now pause and stop the story right there. If you were to ask that guy who had been forgiven the first one, if you were to ask the guy right there, are you grateful for the king forgiving you? He would say, absolutely. He would have all kinds of testimony about the generosity and about the favor and about the grace of the king. He would not point to the fact that he is about to be identified differently in the story. This happens all the time in church. We are forgiven. We receive grace, and we talk and boast and clamor and worship about the grace and about the favor and about the forgiveness of God. And that's our story on the surface, and yet in our heart, I'm going to hold somebody to payment that they can never give. And the story continues that he won't forgive this particular guy. The king hears about it and ultimately throws the first guy into prison and says, until your debt is paid, you'll be in prison. You'll never get out of this. And I think this is fascinating that in the parable that's supposed to be like a mirror for us to reflect in ourselves, the guy's identity is changed not because of his debt, but because of his demand on repayment. You think about that for a second. I don't get re-identified because of my debt. I get it because of my demand for repayment from somebody when they wrong or offend me. And it becomes a powerful thing when I start to think about, is there a cow under my rug? Like, do I have a set of criticisms that won't go away? Do I have a set of offenses that won't go away? Do I have a set of wounds that won't go away? I was thinking about wounds this week, and I was thinking about the wounds that we carry in our body. Like, if you just kind of placate me here for a second, I broke my clavicle as a teenager in a bike racing accident. I tore my shoulder labrum in a surfing accident. Broke a rib in a jiu-jitsu training session. This happened, I had stitches on my chin when I was real young. I was jumping in pool, and I decided I could do some cool trick, and it didn't work out. I've got stitches on my wrist. That was my brother chasing me, and I fell on gutter. My brother also contributed to my forehead. Had stitches on my forehead. My mom, we were fighting, and she made us go clean up the dog poop. I was holding the bag. He had the shovel. He wanted to continue the fight, so he took the shovel and hit me in the head. So I had to have knee surgery from baseball. Had a broken foot from jiu-jitsu. Broke my hand. We won't talk about how that happened. Had stitches here on my hand from a glass accident. When you look at this, it looks a bit silly, right? And I have a lot of wounds. I have other ones, broken bones and stitches and everything. I'm a mess. The only place that still hurts is my shoulder. My shoulder still hurts if I'm lifting weights. It still hurts. But I thought, this is a picture of our soul sometimes. You went through something. Maybe the family got split, or maybe a relationship fell apart, or something happened, and you've got wounds. And some of them don't hurt anymore, but some of them still do. And it begs the question, what do you do with your wounds? What do you do when something comes? People will say all the time, there's a phrase, don't have a cow. I think sometimes out of your control, you have a cow. You got offended. You got wounded. I would add to it, I think a better way of framing it is don't hide your cow. And if you have dealt with any of these things, I have 2 suggestions for us today, just 2 simple suggestions as to how we might go about trying to handle these kind of things. And number 1, you can write this in your notes. Aim to become an at-your-word person instead of being a by-sight person. Aim to be an at-your-word person instead of being a by-sight person. And let me explain what I'm talking about with that. There's a situation where Peter is out fishing. He's fishing all night, and Jesus comes to him and says, hey, Peter, throw your net on the other side. And Peter thinks, that's not going to make any difference. I'm a fisherman. I know that that's not going to make any difference. But he makes this interesting statement. He says, at your word, and then he does it. And there's this idea of at your word, because you said to do it. I don't understand it. I don't feel it, but at your word, I'll do this. The Apostle Paul would pick up on the same kind of thinking in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7, when he says that we live by faith and not by sight. I mentioned earlier that, I was on that cruise with my daughters. I don't have great equilibrium. So I can do a number of things athletically, shake me a little, and I'll fall over. When we came off of the boat, there's this thing called Disembarkment Syndrome. And Disembarkment Syndrome is that feeling, if you've been out on a boat for some time and you feel the next day like you're still on the boat, like I'm still moving, that's called Disembarkment Syndrome. The next day, I was having that bad. It was like if I was moving, I was fine. If I sat still, things started to feel like they were moving. We were in here. I had gotten back on a Monday. We were in here as a staff on Tuesday. We were praying over the prayer needs that come our way. And John Castillo had something on the screen, and I'm reading the scriptures on the screen. I was sitting over in this front area over here, and it was though the screen started moving on me. And I'm sitting there thinking, that's weird. However, I know it's me and not that the screen is actually moving. I know what it is that's causing my perception of this. You see, sometimes you can have gone through something and it reframes how you see scenarios. And it can look like things are moving. And if you're a by-sight person, then you're going to trust what you see more than you're going to trust His Word. You'll see you'll operate according to what you see in forgiveness or grace or reconciliation, according to how you see it, not so much at your word. And if you were to write something beside that section of your notes and write 2 words, behaviors and confidence, when you live at His word, there's a set of behaviors that follow at His word. And there's a confidence that can come because of those behaviors, where you are able to have confidence in saying, Lord, I know that you have plans for me. When you're saying at your word over your kids, when your kids are doing things that you can't control and it's like by sight will drive me nuts. But Lord, at your word, I'm entrusting them to you. At your word, I'm praying for them. There can be a confidence that doesn't come from what you see. There's a confidence that comes from His word. But if I'm a by-sight person only, and I do things only by what I see and process, then it's going to be likely that I have an absence of God confidence in a variety of scenarios. And certainly when I'm trying to hide a cow under the rug. I've got criticism on why I'm in this job. I've got criticism over my spouse. I'm offended by the people around me. The wounds are festering. They're just kind of there. And I'll keep throwing the rug over it. And it's as though my faith is like this disembarkment syndrome. It's really tough to trust what I'm seeing. The challenge for us is to say, Lord, I want to be an at-your-word person. Now, let me be very honest. This is my opinion. If you disagree with me, you're wrong. I do not think you get at-your-word living overnight. I think it's a process. I think it's a commitment. I think it's something that you commit your way to saying, Lord, I want to be an at-your-word person. And over the next 5 years or over the next 10 years or over however long you afford me, I want to become more and more at your word. I don't think that you just say one prayer and suddenly I'm at his word on everything. I think that there's this process of, Lord, I want to become more and more an at-your-word dad. I want to be an at-your-word man in this culture. I want to be an at-your-word husband or wife or mom, or I want to be an at-your-word lady in this culture. And you make that commitment. And I think if we do that, we can go to number 2. I do not think number 2 can come before number 1. I just don't. But if I'm in the process of at your word, then I can go to number 2, and that is that I can release my need for repayment. I can release my need for repayment. Now, this is really important that I say something here before I push into the components of this. And you got to hear me on this. I'm not talking to everybody on this component, but I'm probably talking to somebody. I am not in any way in this message trying to give you legal advice. If you're in the middle of a lawsuit you've been embezzled from, or maybe you're in the middle of an alimony fight or child support, I am in no way trying to make this message legal advice for you as to what you do. But I do know something happens in the heart before it ever happens in our hands. And I'm talking about how our heart operates because our faith is connected there. And I've got to, in my heart, somehow, some way, be able to operate not under a rug. I have to be able to operate and live in a way that grace is exuded, even if I have to make some hard decisions. And so I've got to somehow, by his grace, release this need in my heart to have repayment. And I will tell you that is really, really easy to say. It is incredibly difficult to live out. It is incredibly difficult to live out. And that's why I think we have to be an at-your-word person beforehand. But this could come from a parent. There could be somebody in here, and it wouldn't be you, it would be the person on the other side of the room, but they have a parent that they desperately need repayment from. I need to hear them say something. It could be one of their kids. I need to hear them have some form of contrition for what went down and what was said. It did not have to go down like that. It could happen within a step family. Once you introduce that, it gets gray and fuzzy. It could happen from a friend that went into business. It could happen from a variety of things. And I feel like I need some measure of repayment, some form of words or some form of reaching out in that regard. And Lord, how many times do I put myself through that? 7? He says, as often as it happens to you. Now, there's a verse in the book of Proverbs that has been one of my favorite for many years, and we're going to see it in just a second. It is not one of my favorite because it's easy. It is not one of my favorites because I have this thing mastered. It's one of my favorite because it challenges and bothers me, if I could be honest. And here's what it says in Proverbs 18, verse 19. It says, an offended brother is more unyielding than a fortified city, and disputes like the barred gates of Citadel. If you're with us regularly, you've heard me reference this verse a number of times. The visual, for those that are unfamiliar with this passage, the visual that is connected here, in the ancient, if somebody had offended or wronged somebody, committed a crime or owed taxes, they could be excommunicated from the town. And when they were excommunicated from the town, they were not allowed back into the city quarters until they came to the wall ready to pay their taxes. So somebody would stand on this wall and basically ask, are you here to make payment? And if not, you're not coming in. And it's simply saying that an offended brother, somebody's wounded, somebody that's got a cow under the rug, stands on a wall and they see that person, and I am not letting you back into my life. I am not letting you back into my heart. I am not letting you back in unless you are here to make payment. And we can do that with people that we love and people that God has connected us to. And it's just pointing to this reality that we can either live that way or we can operate in a measure that is different. And we know, you and I know, people that don't make payments very well, aren't reliable. Let me give you this illustration. Let's say, for instance, you have a friend, and you and that friend are going to go to the football game. You're going to go to a Bucs game next year, and you buy the tickets. And they say, I'll pay you back. And you have the tickets, and then you go to get that payment, and they're like, so I'm not going to go. And you're like, I should have never bought your ticket until I had money. The next time that they say, hey, let's go to the game, you're like, you pay me first, right? Yeah, I'm not buying your ticket because I got burned once before. Peter's asking, how many times do I buy the ticket? How many times do I do that? And Jesus is pushing on the reality that your question is wrong. You're pushing more on the pain that's behind the question. And I'm going to give you an answer and point to something that points to your heart, not so much what's getting repaid. The challenge for us is in life, there are times without your acceptance or without your wanting of it, a cow will come along. Criticism, offense, or wounds. And the real question isn't what comes along. The real question is, do I try and hide that, or do I walk in a place of grace, allowing the fact that God has forgiven me and extended grace, and can I walk in a way that extends that as well? And as we pull back and we think about today, if you were to take the entirety of this whole day and not just think about just this message, our first song talking about this unrelenting love of God. And then we talk about this mighty to save. That no matter what wall I might be up against, no matter what I may face, no matter what come to my doorstep, you are mighty to save. And then I'm confronted by this almost borderline recklessness love of God, this without limit, this without border, that he would pursue me, embrace me, and then I'm challenged on how I live out of that love. I would simply challenge each of us, and I pray that as you drive away today, that it's not so much about whether you have criticism, offense, or a wound. It's not so much about whether you have a cow. It's about whether you're trying to hide that cow under the rug. And my encouragement for us today is to pull the rug back and say, Lord, this is what happened. And would you help me to be an at your word person? So whatever you want me to do, whether there be a legal matter, whether it be a relational matter, whether it be whatever, Lord, I want to be an at your word person. Help me to be in process of this. As I do that, as you do that, we will find ourselves, I believe, starting to walk and live in a grace that I think he has extended and invites us all into. This morning, I want to pray for us. Would you join me? Father, this morning, we come before you, and we're talking about hard topic. At the same time, Lord, you never shied away from hard topics. You were never intimidated to discuss hard matters. And we pray, Father, first and foremost, Lord, that we would be an at your word person. Lord, your grace that was extended to us, covered us, forgave us. We're grateful for it. We're receptive today. If I just pause the prayer for just a moment, if you're here today and you do not know Christ, you've never said yes to him, I hope through the entirety of our time this morning, you've had a window to see the love of God that is not limited in any way to reach you, and the invitation to know him and to walk in a love with him is always afforded to you. It can begin through the simplicity of saying yes in a prayer. And that prayer represents faith, and that faith is an invitation to a life following the Lord and him walking with you. If you've never said yes to the Lord and you say, I want to today, would you just say this and say, Jesus, today I give you my heart. I give you every part of me. By faith, I recognize that you loved me so much that you would die for me, that my sins could be forgiven, I could have new life. Would you be my Lord and leader from this day forward? Father, for all of us, we pray as that we leave these doors, that we would walk in your grace, and we would be those that are able to extend grace. And if any of us do have a cow, that we'd pull the rug back, and we'd be at your word, men and women, as we follow you, and you give us a peace and a grace towards how to handle those situations. I pray that you'd bless your people, not only today, but in this entire week. Jesus, we love you. In Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen.